Welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Matthew Camp. I am Teachers College Director of Government Relations and Community Engagement. And we are joined together to talk about public service loan forgiveness and how to navigate the process, where part of the TC Take Action initiative, which kind of mobilizes the TC community to respond to pressing issues of the day and pressing policies. This one hits us all in the wallet. Speaking from personal experience, took me years and years and years to navigate this process. And I read government rules for a living, and it was still a major headache, got denied and denied. My dad, a TC graduate from back in the day, same deal, but eventually the loans were forgiven. And as you could imagine, it's a game changer. So we want to extend that opportunity to our friends and colleagues here in the room from TC who've been working so hard in public service for so many years and want to make this dream come true. So we are joined by two amazing colleagues here. Let me just hit the settings, make sure we're good to go. Okay, so we've got Tani Castaneda, who's Chief Enrollment Officer and Associate Vice President at the Division of Enrollment Management at Teachers College. Hi, Tani. And Amy Suzula, who's Sulada, from the Student Borrower Protection Center, an amazing nonprofit organization who will help us navigate this process. I'll hand it off to Tani.
Yeah, so by way of further introduction, thanks, Matt. Appreciate your office's work. Arlen's here from the Division of Enrollment Management, primarily through our Office of Financial Aid is, of course, one of supporting students in their pursuit of attaining their education and understanding the responsibilities and implications that come along with financing one's education and the subsequent management of that, sometimes, as we all know, over the course of a very significant portion of your life. We also share what has become a real national concern, not only about access and affordability when it comes to obtaining a higher education, but with debt burden and debt relief. I think we're all becoming familiar with those concepts. So we look at it as part of our duty to connect the community with resources that can support optimal management of financial aid. And in this case, the possibility of offering some relief. So I'm really happy to have with us Amy Sulada. She is the Outreach and Advocacy Manager at the Student Borrower Protection Center. Amy's career history includes previous roles at the largest union of property service workers in the country, and in research and activism around wage theft in the greater Denver area. So you can see activism is definitely in her career wheelhouse here. She holds a master's degree in international studies from the University of Denver and has a bachelor's degree from LaSalle University. So now with the nonprofit Student Borrower Protection Center, Amy works with a team that focuses on building projects, launching projects and partnerships across the US in order to lead a nationwide effort to protect student loan borrowers and to halt abuse by the student loan industry. So we're really grateful to have her expertise here today to shed a little bit more light on the public service loan forgiveness program. So Amy, I'm going to hand it over to you and your colleague, Kat Welbeck, to manage the session.
Thank you so much, Tani and Matt. It's so good to be here with you today. Thank you so much for having me. We're really excited to be here. Let me first share my screen so that you can not look at me the entire time. And then we'll get started. Okay, so as Tani mentioned, my name is Amy Sulada. I'm the Outreach and Advocacy Manager at the Student Borrower Protection Center. And we are going to talk about the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program today, and in particular, the current rules under the waiver that's in effect until October. A little bit of background on the Student Borrower Protection Center. We are a national nonprofit policy organization focused solely on alleviating the debt burden of student debt in the country. And so we do this through a mix of advocacy, policymaking, and litigation strategy to rein in industry abuses, protect borrowers' rights, and advance economic opportunity for the next generation of students. I'm so excited to speak with you today. If you have questions as they come up, you can throw them in the chat. My colleagues will be collecting them so that we can review them at the end of the presentation. But otherwise, let's get started talking about the program. So let's talk about the program as it was created and how it functioned until very recently. So Congress created the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program in 2007 as as a way to help public service workers who are struggling with their student loan debt, and also to make sure that future students and graduates wouldn't be deterred from entering the public service because of their student loan balances. And to put it simply, PSLF is the promise that if a borrower works in public service for 10 years and makes payments on their loans for that time, the remainder of their debts will be forgiven after those 10 years. But as you'll see, and as I'm sure you already know if you're here, it's a bit more complicated than that. So first, I'm going to explain how the program works or has worked, what some of the issues with the program were, and then how you can benefit from the current waiver period to access your own PSLF student loan forgiveness. So how does PSLF actually work? More than simply working in public service for 10 years, there are traditionally 4 specific criteria. So first, you have to have a direct loan. That's one of several federal loan types. Second, you need to be in the correct repayment plan, which for the program is generally an income-driven repayment plan or an IDR plan. Third, you need to work in public service. And finally, you need to make 120 qualifying payments or 10 years worth of payments. I'll drill down on some of these for a moment. So only direct loans qualify for public service loan forgiveness. Direct loans have been the main federal loan since 2010. So if you took out a loan since then, it likely qualifies. If you have an older loan, a federal family education loan, or sometimes abbreviated to FFEL loans, or a Perkins loan, those do not qualify. But what you can do is you can consolidate those loans into a new direct loan, which is like refinancing with the federal government, and it pays off your old loan and replaces it with a new direct loan. Under the normal program, when you did this, you lost any credit that you had gained toward forgiveness because you're essentially consolidating and taking out a new loan. As we'll discuss in a moment, though, during the special waiver period, this isn't the case. So it's important to know that under the normal program requirements, many people were blocked out of the program completely based on their loan type. Second, your direct loan needs to be in the right repayment plan, which is generally an income-driven repayment plan or an IDR plan. And it doesn't matter how much you're paying, just that it's the right plan. And these plans include income-based repayment or IBR, income contingent repayment or ICR, pay spelled PAYE or pay as you earn, or repay spelled REPAYE or revised pay as you earn. Some other payment plans in certain instances can qualify, but in general, you want to be on an income-driven repayment plan. Okay, third, to get public service loan forgiveness, you need to work in public service. And the focus is on your employer, not on your role. And you can work at a government organization, so that covers most city, state, federal, and tribal employees, a 501c3 nonprofit, or certain other nonprofits. You also have to work full-time, which is defined as 30 hours a week, or whatever your employer says is full-time if it's greater than 30 hours a week. And the 30 hours can be with more than one employer if you have multiple part-time jobs that would add up to 30 hours a week. Okay, finally, you need to make 120 of these qualifying payments, which are payments on the right loan, in the right repayment plan, and during the correct employment. The payments have to be made in full and on time. And if you leave public service and then come back, you can continue accruing credits and you don't need to start over. So the payments and the time in employment doesn't need to be consecutive. There have been some impacts of COVID on the public service loan forgiveness program. So first, really important, for those loans that are getting the payment pause, those that are owned by the federal government, each month of suspended payments counts towards PSLF loan forgiveness, towards the 120 payments needed, for forgiveness. However, you still need to meet each of the other criteria, and the most relevant of these is the public service employer. So now we'll talk a little bit about what has changed in the program and why. As you may already know, the initial rejection rate for the program was 99%. Only some 800 applications out of 90,000 were approved, and folks were being denied because they had the wrong loan, or they weren't in the right repayment program, or some other technical reason that had nothing to do with whether they actually worked 10 years in public service. And as you can imagine, this was a huge problem and an incredible failure for all of the workers that PSLF was meant to support. Many folks took out debt to become teachers or government lawyers, specifically because they had been told that after 10 years of affordable payments, the remainder of their debts would be forgiven. But some good news on this front is that in the summer of 2021, last summer, the Department of Education, for the first time ever, issued something called a request for information. And they wanted to hear from borrowers about their PSLF experiences. This was an opportunity for borrowers who have worked for 10 years in public service, but who were going to get locked out of the program because of the bureaucratic program criteria, or someone who had delayed retirement to get those extra qualifying payments. They could finally ask the Biden administration to fix the program once and for all. And nearly 50,000 borrowers submitted comments sharing their experiences with PSLF. And this was a huge response to the government's request and had a consistent message. The program wasn't working for those it was meant for. Within weeks of this request for information period ending, the federal government announced a special waiver period that would address many of the issues raised by borrowers during the RFI period. So for a limited time, the Department of Education will retroactively grant credit towards PSLF loan forgiveness to borrowers for months that previously didn't count for the program, either because they had the wrong loan type or they weren't making the right payment. So we'll talk through these changes now. Okay, essentially what the department's waiver does is give public service workers credit towards loan forgiveness, regardless of what type of federal loan they have, and as long as they were in qualifying public service employment and their loan wasn't in default, deferment, or forbearance. So even for months in which borrowers did not actively make a payment, as long as the loan was in repayment status, they can receive credit. And these credits will be retroactive, so borrowers can receive credit for past payments that were previously ineligible. In short, for any months since October 1st, 2007, when the program began, that a borrower had any type of federal loan, worked for a qualifying public service employer, and was not in default, deferment, or forbearance, that borrower can receive credit towards the 120 months required for loan forgiveness under PSLF. Now, as with PSLF, the income-driven repayment program has not lived up to its promises of delivering debt relief. And in April of this year, the Department of Education announced that it would review the IDR process and count some periods of forbearance and deferment. So this means that if borrowers had periods of forbearance, excuse me, up to 12 consecutive months of forbearance, or over 36 cumulative months of forbearance, they can receive credit for those months that will count towards their PSLF total count. In addition, the department is counting periods of deferment prior to 2013. So in some cases, excuse me, periods of forbearance and deferment will count towards the 120 credits needed for forgiveness. And we're waiting on additional details from the Department of Education still on what this will look like. And we can provide them as we receive them. But this is a good thing because it will only mean more qualifying payments for some borrowers. No one will lose qualifying payments as a result of this reconsideration. Okay, it's important to note that this waiver is not completely automatic. So normally PSLF requires that borrowers have a specific loan type, a direct loan, as I discussed. Although the waiver allows borrowers with any loan type to get credit through consolidation, although the waiver allows borrowers with any loan type to get credit, those without direct loans will need to take some steps to convert their loans into direct loans through a process called consolidation, though they still will get time or credit for time before the conversion. And almost all borrowers, regardless of loan types, will have to certify with the Department of Education any periods of qualifying public service work since October 1st, 2007. And the idea here is that if the government doesn't know when you had qualifying work, it can't award you the right credits. Okay, importantly, this waiver only lasts until October 31st, 2022. So this means that any borrower who must change their loan type through consolidation or certify their public service work with the Department of Education must do so before this deadline. This does not mean that everyone will receive their new credit by this deadline. just that the paperwork on the borrower's end must be completed. And credits will be given on a rolling basis, and the department might take more time beyond this deadline to process everyone. Although if you get credits from the waiver, those credits are permanent, so you can continue to accrue more credits, adding to those that you got during the waiver after this deadline of October 31st. So with this in mind, there are 3 things that all public service workers with federal student loans should do. So to figure out how this waiver applies to you and what steps you need to take, every borrower should do 3 things. Briefly, they are to confirm your past and present employers are PSLF eligible, determine your loan types and consolidate if necessary, and then certify your employment with the Department of Education. So first, confirm that you have a qualifying employer. You, as employees of the Columbia Teachers College, are all eligible, but you might have past employment that is also eligible. So we like to drill down on what eligible employers are. So you might hear this a couple times. So nothing about this requirement changed during the waiver period. You'll still need to work in public service, except that for during the waiver period, you don't still need to be employed at the time that you apply for forgiveness after your 120 payments. Remember that qualifying employers are any government employer, which includes federal, state, local, or tribal, any nonprofits that have a 501c3 tax exempt status, and then certain other nonprofits also qualify. However, unions and political organizations do not. So any organization that has a 501c4 status will not be eligible, and neither will any for-profit employers. If you're not sure whether or not your past employment qualifies as public service, there is a database that you can check with the Department of Education that you can search. It's important to note, though, that this list isn't necessarily exhaustive. So if your employer doesn't appear, but you still believe that they're a qualifying public service employer, you can still proceed with the PSLF process. And you can access this list by using the PSLF help tool, which is available at studentaid.gov here. And the employer database is the first step in the help tool, so you can quickly access it to check that your past and present employers are eligible. Okay, step 2. What type of loans do you have? The 3 major loan types today that most folks have are direct loans, federal family education loans or FFEL loans, and then Perkins loans. For public service workers to get to get loan forgiveness for their FFEL and Perkins loans under the waiver, they'll need to consolidate those loans into a direct loan. Remember, what's special about the waiver period is that normally when you consolidated your loans, you lost any past credit that you had gained towards loan forgiveness. But during the waiver, you can keep that past credit and apply it to the new consolidated loan. Okay, the final step that all public service workers with federal student loans should do is certify their employment with the Department of Education. Remember that qualifying employers are any level of government, 501c3 nonprofit employers, and certain other nonprofit employers. The form to do this is called the PSLF form, but it was previously called an Employment Certification Form, or ECF. Borrowers should certify their employment using the PSLF help tool, which is the same tool that you can use to confirm that your past and present employers are eligible. That tool will generate the form that you need, and then your employer will have to sign that form. Okay, so we've discussed the 3 steps borrowers should take to make sure they benefit from the current waiver period. Now I'm going to show you some brief step-by-step instructions on how to do all of this, and we'll start by confirming your employer is PSLF eligible. So you'll need to log into studentaid.gov, and if you don't know your login information, there is a way to reset it and gain access. Once you're there, you'll hover over Manage Loans in the top toolbar, and then click on Public Service Loan Forgiveness in the drop-down menu, and then you'll see the PSLF help tool there, which you should click to launch. Borrowers can look up all of their employers since October of 2007 in the help tool by entering their tax employer identification number, or EIN, and then your dates of employment as well. And you can check your employer's EIN by looking at your W-2, by asking your employer, or for some larger employers, you could even Google them. If your employer appears when you run the search, your employer is a confirmed public service employer. So you can proceed to the next steps of checking your loan types and consolidating them if necessary. If your employer doesn't appear when you run the search, you could still be eligible. because this list isn't exhaustive. It could mean that no one else from this place of employment has sought PSLF in the past. So don't be discouraged by this, especially if you know that you work for a government agency or a 501c3 nonprofit and you know that you're eligible. So some eligible employers will show up as ineligible. Okay, once you've determined whether your employers are eligible, you should confirm what types of loans you have. This can be really confusing and many folks don't necessarily know. So to see all of your federal loans, you should log in again to studentaid.gov. You'll have a dashboard there that lists your loans, and any that say that they are direct loans, and any that don't say direct will need to be consolidated. And for a more granular list, you can download your aid data your loan data, I'm sorry, and you can see on this slide how to navigate to your data. Now, when you're looking at the dashboard that lists your loans, you can see the current balance, and there are little arrows that will break down the loan types that you have. Here you can see that this person already consolidated their loans, and they already have direct loans. So once you're on this page, you'll be able to tell which type of loans you have. And you can see the other categories listed here as well, like Perkins or Graduate Plus loans, etc. And certainly if you download your aid data using the instructions from the previous slide, you'll be able to see which ones are direct and which ones are not direct. Now, if you have non-direct loans, you'll need to consolidate those. So to consolidate your loans, we're going to go back to studentaid.gov again, hover over Manage Loans, and then click on Consolidate My Loans in the drop-down menu. You can access the consolidation application here. It'll then guide you through next steps that you'll need to take, which includes selecting the loans you want to include in the consolidation, confirming the amount and rate of the new loan, and then selecting your payment plan and servicer and signing for the loan. Now here's a tip specific to the waiver. So if you have a mix of older and newer loans, so some would be closer to the 10 years needed for forgiveness under PSLF, if you consolidate all the loans together, the new loan will be awarded as much credit towards forgiveness as your oldest existing loan. So this is really useful for folks who have older FFEL loans, but also newer direct loans. You might not think to consolidate your direct loans because they already qualify, but if you did, they'd be on the same timeline as your older FFEL loans. So that's really good news. Okay. Remember that for the regular PSLF program, you need to be enrolled in an income-driven repayment plan or an IDR plan. So when you're consolidating, it's a good idea to select one of the IDR plans as your payment plan. Some of these go by names like income-based repayment or IBR, income contingent repayment or ICR, pay and repay. And these payment plans within income-driven repayment are all different. And there is a payment calculator tool that will help you choose the plan among these four that is best for you. Excuse me. Okay. Finally, let's review how to certify your employment. So just like confirming that your employers qualify, you'll need to log into studentaid.gov again, hover over Manage Loans, and click on Public Service Loan Forgiveness in the drop-down menu. So we're going to go back to the PSLF help tool here. You'll remember this step from earlier. This was the first step in the help tool. So here's where you'll add your employers using the EIN and your dates of employment. And then after this, excuse me, the PSLF help tool will guide borrowers through next steps, which include identifying the loans that they want to include in the PSLF loan forgiveness. Once you complete each of the tool steps, it'll generate a form for you that you can use to certify your employment. Again, this form is called a PSLF form, but it was previously called an ECF. So if you submitted one in the past, it was called an ECF. And this is the form that you must submit to get all the benefits of the PSLF waiver. So once you have the PSLF form, you'll need to have any employer you're claiming as a public service employer sign the form. And once the form is signed, you must submit it to the designated federal student loan servicer for processing to make sure that you get the maximum benefit that you qualify for. Everyone must submit a new form that reflects all of their qualifying public service work by that deadline of October 31st, 2022. Excuse me, in order to benefit from the waiver. And if you worked for a nonprofit that is now closed, or if your employer is refusing to sign the form, there is a box to check on the form that one of these is the case. So if these are issues that borrowers are encountering, there are ways around them. And to send the form, you're able to fax them or mail them in. Additionally, if you already have Fed loan servicing, which is the current exclusive servicer for the PSLF program, there is an option to upload documents to their website. You could also do all three of these things if you're nervous about the forms getting there and want to ensure that they are received. You may have heard that Fed loan servicing has announced that it will be exiting the student loan market, and it's going to be transferring its entire PSLF portfolio to a company called Mohila. I'll get to more specifics on what this means for borrowers in a moment, but I want to flag here in case some borrowers currently have Fed loan servicing as their servicer. Okay, so what is the process for getting forgiveness? This is the general process, but it also applies to the waiver. So as I mentioned, FIA operating as Fed loan servicing is currently the exclusive servicer for the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. However, all PSLF accounts are in the process of being transferred to Mohila. So borrowers seeking PSLF need to send the PSLF form to Mohila, which will do a preliminary review of loan eligibility. And if you have a qualifying loan, your loan will then be transferred to Mohila for servicing, at which point it will run through the other criteria such as employment and qualifying payments. Unfortunately, there have been a lot of problems with people finding out too late in the game that they thought they qualified, but something had gone wrong. So for this reason, we advise that as soon as you're interested in PSLF, you submit a form, as soon as you're interested, and then do it every year until you qualify for forgiveness, and then also do it anytime you switch public service employers. You don't have to do this. You could document everything after 10 years, but this is a great way to have, oversight and catch any issues earlier that might arise as they happen. And the Department of Education has stated that they are continuing to review PSLF cases on a rolling basis. So there's no exact timeline for when you might receive notification from them. If you already have Fed loan servicing as your servicer, that account will be transferred to Mohila soon. The companies will handle the transfer itself. However, it's best practice to keep your own copies of all of your records because sometimes things get lost from one company to another. So if this transfer is going to affect you, we'd recommend keeping and downloading all of your account records as well. Okay, finally, we'll talk about some common issues that borrowers have faced pertaining to the waiver and how to address them. So when you submit your PSLF form or your employment certification form, it's important that you make sure the form is easy to read. If your employer has written over or tried to correct anything on the form, you should request a new clean application from them. Often, if anything is crossed out or written over, like in this picture, the form will automatically be rejected, or the time that you worked for this employer will not count with your other applications. Your application could be delayed or rejected as is, so requesting that they complete a new form could save you a lot of time. When borrowers complete the PSLF help tool, the form suggests that a borrower must take their loans out of administrative forbearance under the payment pause, stating the following under the subheading, get out of deferment or forbearance. This can be a bit confusing. So because student loans were placed into administrative forbearance under the payment pause, and pause payments continue to count for PSLF eligibility, borrowers do not need to stop postponing payments in order to make qualifying payments. Although the form goes on to state this, that a borrower doesn't need to remove their loans from the payment pause, we understand how this can be a little confusing. Excuse me. Okay, if you choose to use the PSLF help tool to complete your PSLF application, many borrowers are unsure how to proceed when they get to the question on this slide. If you think that you've already made over 120 qualifying payments, the PSLF help tool might not let you choose that option. This is okay. Just ignore it and choose no, I haven't made 120 qualifying payments and move on. Don't let this question hold you up from taking the necessary steps to receive the benefits of the PSLF waiver. No matter what you select on this page, your account will still be reviewed in full by the Department of Education. So finally, from what we have seen, notices with inaccurate PSLF payment counts have been one of the biggest sources of confusion with the PSLF waiver and help tool. So if you're consolidating an older FFEL loan in order to take advantage of the PSLF waiver, you'll receive a letter from Fed loan servicing after the consolidation is complete, noting that you have one qualifying PSLF payment. Don't worry when you receive this letter. Here's what is actually happening. This is an auto-generated letter that is hard-coded to review under the standard PSLF program requirements that we reviewed at the very beginning of this presentation. When you consolidate your loans, you'll be asked if you're doing so to take advantage of the PSLF program. And since you are consolidating for PSLF, you'll say yes. And after your consolidation is complete, Fed Loan will notify the Department of Education, who will review your account to determine how many qualifying payments you've made towards the PSLF waiver. You'll then receive a second letter from Fed Loan or MOHELA at this point, saying how many payments you have towards the waiver. And as I mentioned before, this process can take a few weeks to a few months to complete. And the Department of Education does these in batches. So there's no concrete timeline for when you might receive notice about your application. Okay, so before we get to questions, let's just review some important takeaways. So remember that for the PSLF waiver, credit will be given for months during which any loan type was in repayment status and not in default, deferment, or forbearance. However, in addition, some months of forbearance and deferment will count, particularly forbearances that are 12 consecutive months or over 36 cumulative months, and any deferment before 2013 because of the Idr Account Adjustment that was announced in April. Remember that the deadline to apply is October 31st, 2022. And before that deadline, you need to consolidate if you don't have direct loans, and then also submit your PSLF forms so that you can certify your employment with the Department of Education. And then follow the steps in this order of the presentation. So first, confirm that your past and present employers are eligible, then confirm your loan types. And if you don't have direct loans, consolidate them into direct loans. And then finally, submit a PSLF form for any qualifying public service work that you've had since October 1st, 2007. And then if you experience any issues, file a complaint. New York State has an ombudsperson that you can reach out to. In addition, you could reach out to the Federal Student Aid Ombudsperson. So there are options to complain if you have experienced issues. Okay, so I realize that was a lot of information for a Tuesday afternoon and not the most rousing topic. So we would love to get your questions. And I think Kat is going to help me out with this.
Yes, thanks so much, Amy. And that was a lot of information. Just to give you a second to get yourself together, I'll start with one question that we got at the top, and someone was asking, will this recording be available later? Yes, this is being recorded. And so I believe that's going to be shared out after today's presentation. So it's okay if you may have missed some things earlier. Alrighty, so Amy, I'm going to start at the top, and then just a reminder to everyone, we recorded down your questions, but we may not be able to give specific advice to scenarios, but we're going to try our best to answer the questions in a way that should answer the question that you asked, but also give pretty broad answers to other people who might have similar questions. So the first one, Amy, I'm going to break this question out into two. One, so someone asks if you need to be a full-time teacher's college employee to benefit from PSLF. So two things. One, do you have to work at teacher's college to benefit from PSLF? And then two, do you need to be full-time to benefit from PSLF?
This is a great question. So if you do work at the Columbia Teachers College, you know, that is a plus because you automatically qualify because it's a public service employer. If you don't work full-time, that's okay. You can work multiple part-time jobs. So remember that the requirements are that you work for a public service employer and that you work there full-time. And that's defined as 30 hours a week or whatever your employer deems as full-time if it's over 30 hours a week. If you have multiple part-time jobs that add up to 30 hours a week and they're with multiple public service employers, that could work. You just need to submit multiple PSLF forms for all that employment. So if you work 10 hours a week at the Columbia Teachers College and then you work another 20 at a government agency or at another nonprofit, you just need to submit as many forms as you have employers to make that time count.
Thanks, Amy. And as a follow-up to that, so really, really helpful also adding in the part-time piece about multiple part-time jobs for qualifying employers counting. But then also, so say someone's worked at an employer for different periods of time. One, so two questions there. So if you've worked for multiple employers for different periods of time, do you need an ECF, a PSLF form for each period of time where you worked for that employer? And then also, does the service have to be cumulative? Can you add together different periods of employment from multiple employers?
So sorry, I have a qualifying question on the first
Yeah,
question.
please do.
So is that the same employer that you're saying that you worked at the same employer for different periods of time and
Yes.
you want to know how to do that? Okay.
Mhm.
Then yes, I would submit different PSLF forms for that, I believe. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Cap, but I would make sure they're separate so that it's clear like what period of time you're requesting it for, if it was like not, if it was not consecutive.
Agreed.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, awesome. And then the second question, can you repeat the second question? I'm sorry, I forgot it.
No, it's all good. It was a part of your answer. Also, does work have to be consecutive for you to qualify for PSLF? So can you have multiple periods of qualifying employment over different periods of time?
Yeah, this is a great question, especially since, you know, our careers are not often straight paths, right? So you might work in public service for 5 years and then you might work for the private sector for 2 years and then go back to public service. So the time in employment does not have to be consecutive. So if that's a situation that applies to you, you know, you would just submit PSLF forms for any qualifying public service employer that you've had since 2007. So obviously, like the time in that you were working for a private employer in the private sector wouldn't count towards PSLF forgiveness, but the other time, any time that you've spent in public service since 2007 in October would count towards PSLF loan forgiveness.
Thanks, Amy. That's really helpful. And then there's one question I have that I have the answer here for, so I'm going to read it out. But we also got a question because we're getting quite a few questions specifically about who at Teachers College should sign the form. So it seems like that's going to be human resources. But Amy, do you also mind following up? So if we have people who may have other qualifying employers at other periods of time, do you mind talking a little bit about like a different employers who might be the right person to get to sign that form?
Yeah, this is a great question. So it does depend on the employer. So if you have had multiple employers, and many people have, it will depend on the employer. Some employers are fielding all of that through an HR department. Some employers are saying that it's fine if a supervisor, you know, signs for it. It really is up to the employer. And so yeah, it really depends. Also, like I mentioned, if you're having trouble getting those forms signed because either the place is closed or because they're refusing to sign because it's been so long since you worked there, you know, you can check the box on the first page of the PSLF form that says that one of these is the case. And what we've been recommending that people do in that situation is also submit a W-2 from that time period, indicating that you did work there for that time period, because likely the Department of Education will ask for that as a follow-up. So you could kind of get ahead of that and submit a W-2 along with that checkbox. So really what it boils down to for the signature is it just needs to be someone who can verify the time that you spent there working full time. So in some cases that'll be a supervisor, and in some cases they might you know, field that off to the HR department.
Thanks, Amy. It was a lot of really great information. And then we have a question about someone who previously paid off a loan. Are you able to get credit for loans that you've already paid off under the PSLF waiver?
So if you've already paid off your loan, unfortunately you can't get credit for, you know, loans that were paid off prior to this period. If you did, however, make over 120 payments on a direct loan, they are issuing refunds for those for that, you know, those payments that you made over it. It wouldn't count if you made over 120 payments on a FFEL or a Perkins loan, but if you did make them over 120 on a direct loan, then you would get a refund for that. But unfortunately, if you paid off your loans prior to this, then you won't receive any benefit.
Thanks, Amy. And then are there any income limits or income caps for public service loan forgiveness?
Yeah, this is a great question. So there are no income limits or income caps for public service loan forgiveness, and there's no cap on the amount of loans that you could have that would qualify for public service loan forgiveness. The only part where income really comes into play is when you're choosing your income-driven repayment plan. And so that's why we encourage people to look at the payment re-estimator tool to see, you know, how much you'll be paying on a monthly basis, what the parameters of those payment plans look like, because they're all different, right? So like some might benefit people who are married and they file their taxes jointly, but it might be a different situation for someone who is, you know, single. So it's really important to choose the right plan that's the best plan for you, because all 4 of those fall under IDR.
Thanks, Amy, really helpful. And then I just want to circle back to clarify a point. So we have someone who said they've worked for other employers other than Teachers College. Does it matter who your qualifying employer was for PSLF?
So as long as your employer was a qualifying public service employer. So remember, those are any level of government. So that's federal, state, local, and tribal governments, any 501c3 nonprofit, and then certain other nonprofits. So when I say certain other nonprofits, there's a list of them that you can find on the Department of Education's website, but it's things like if you were working in emergency services, but it wasn't technically a 501c3. So it's usually like, it falls under the bucket of like emergency services. So no, you don't have to have only worked for Columbia Teachers College for the past 10 years to get, benefit from this program. It could be any nonprofit, any government agency, in addition to, your service at the Columbia Teachers College.
Awesome. And then Amy, so does that mean people can get retroactive credit for payments they made where they said, I have this qualifying employment since 2007, but I've never submitted a PSLF form. Does this waiver let them get credit for those payments?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the purpose of the waiver, right? To get retroactive credit for these periods of time that you previously were ineligible because you either had the wrong loan type or that you weren't in the right repayment plan. So this waiver was made for you. It's an effort to rectify the situation because, as I mentioned, like only 800 applications out of 90,000 were approved originally. So, this is why you can get retroactive credit now until October 31st to rectify some of the issues that exist in the program prior.
Thanks, Amy. And then also, you mentioned this during the presentation, but do payments during the current payment pause count? So we know because of the CARES Act since March of 2020, most federal student loans have been on pause. Do those periods count for PSLF?
Yes, so I know it sounds too good to be true, but essentially, if you've been working for a nonprofit or a government agency since March of 2020, while the payment pause has been going on, and you have federal loans that were in the payment pause, all that time counts towards PSLF. So essentially, you're gaining like 2.5 years of payments that you didn't have to make while the pandemic was on. So yes, the other criteria still goes into effect, and most importantly, the public service employer. But yes, all that time does count towards PSLF forgiveness.
Thanks, Amy. So do you mind clarifying for people? I know a lot of times it's really confusing, especially for people who graduated during the pandemic. And so their first set of loan payments were during the payment pause. So would they just need to go back and submit a PSLF form if they're working now to get credit for those payments?
That's right. Yep. You would just have to go back and submit a PSLF form. Yeah, because you should already have a direct loan if you graduated during the payment pause. So yeah, that's right.
That's great, Amy. I'm actually glad that you ended there because we had some questions about direct loans. So some people are wondering, they might have a grad plus loan or like different kinds of like a subsidized or unsubsidized direct loan. Do you mind explaining a little bit about one, what's a direct loan? And then do you mind repeating a little bit about how to actually find this out via federal student aid?
Yeah, absolutely. So a direct loan is one that was given to you directly by the federal government. This has been the main loan since 2010. So any loan that was issued to you, since 2010 was likely a direct loan, unless you took out like private loans, which are entirely separate. So essentially you can log into studentaid.gov. There's a dashboard there that will list your loans. When you're looking at that dashboard, you'll be able to tell what is direct and what is not direct. If it doesn't say direct next to it, then it's not a direct loan. So those are the loans that you'll need to consolidate in order to take advantage of the waiver for those particular loans. Unsubsidized or subsidized doesn't matter as long as it says direct next to it. That's what's important here. And so remember that if you also have direct loans and also older Fell loans or older Perkins loans, if you consolidate all of them together, they'll be on the same timeline as your oldest Fell loan. So that's really helpful for people who, went to undergrad, took out Fell loans, worked for a few years in public service, and then went to graduate school and took out direct loans. If you consolidate them all together, that time in employment in between, those two schooling periods would count towards public service loan forgiveness program. So it resets the timeline if you consolidate all of them together. But yes, going to studentaid.gov and looking at your dashboard is how you can find out what loans you have.
Thank you, Amy. That's really helpful. And do you mind repeating that last part? I'm really glad that you added that in about consolidating loans. So they're all on the same timeline. Someone says, I have a direct loan. I have multiple direct loans. Do I have to consolidate? So I think you just explained a little bit about why someone would, but do you mind explaining that one more time specifically for people who have direct loans?
Yeah, certainly. So if you have all direct loans, right, they all qualify. But if the benefit of of consolidating all of them is that they'll be on the same timeline, and it'll be like a little bit more streamlined, and it could save you a number of years if you've had multiple direct loans at different times in your life. So yeah, just remember that if you consolidate them together, they'll be on the timeline of your oldest existing loan. So that is the benefit of consolidating multiple direct loans if you have multiple direct loans.
Thank you, Amy. Really helpful. And then one thing I'm just going to pause really quickly. I'm seeing in the corner of my eye, I'm getting a couple of individual direct message chats. If you don't mind dropping them in the general chat, because I can only see that I'm getting them, but I won't actually be able to compile the questions. So if you do have questions that you've sent to me via direct message, if you don't mind dropping them in the chat so we can try to make sure that we get to all of them. Alrighty. So Amy, next question. Do you mind sharing, I know we talked a little bit about specifically the COVID payment pause, but do you mind talking also about periods of deferment and forbearance? And so when might a deferment count in terms of getting credit for PSLF, or when might a forbearance count? I know you mentioned there are a few rare circumstances.
Yeah, this is a great question. So in essence, periods of forbearance that were 12 consecutive months or over 36 cumulative months will count towards PSLF forgiveness. In addition, any deferments prior to the year 2013 will also count, to help you accrue credit for that PSLF forgiveness. This was not part of the PSLF waiver. This was part of a separate announcement that was made in April called the Idr Account Adjustment. They recognized that the income-driven repayment plans weren't working the way that they should, in the same ways that the PSLF program wasn't working. And so that's when they decided to correct this and allow certain periods of forbearance and deferment to count. So those are the only options that in which forbearances or deferments would count towards PSLF loan forgiveness. Otherwise, you'd need to be in repayment status in order to get credit for that month of PSLF.
Awesome. And then one question that we've gotten, Amy, I'm just going to answer this one just as a follow-up. So someone who graduated during COVID was asking, so for example, they haven't selected a payment plan. That's correct, because if your payments have been paused by the federal government, while those payments still count, during this waiver period, you're especially going to want to submit a PSLF form, because one, like Amy mentioned, you're going to get credit for those months as long as you were in qualifying employment. But someone's saying, but I've never selected an income-driven repayment plan. What's going to be important is, one, that you complete the waiver process to get credit for all of the months where you've been technically in repayment status during the COVID payment pause, even if you weren't actually making a payment. But whenever repayments resume, you're going to want to be in an income-driven repayment plan, because that is required under the typical PSLF rules that Amy went over. So after October 31st of this year, when this waiver ends, you're going to want to make sure that you're still in good shape to take advantage of PSLF. So whenever you do resume repayment, you'll want to make sure that you're in an income-driven repayment plan. And then we've also gotten some questions about the difference between IBR, ICR. Those are different terms also for income-driven repayment plans, and those do qualify for PSLF. So I just wanted to just clarify that really quickly. Amy, we get this question a lot. Also, for the waiver process, people want to know, how long does it take to hear back from the Department of Education? So if you go through these steps, you submit it, when should you expect confirmation on the waiver?
Yeah, so once you submit your application, you should receive notification fairly soon that they at least received your application. So if you don't receive that, then that's when maybe I would contact an ombudsperson to make sure that it was received. But as far as getting the forgiveness or finding out your new payment count under the waiver, it's a bit unclear. So some people have found out within weeks, some people have found out within months. It really depends. And we imagine that as the waiver deadline comes closer, we already know that more people are applying for PSLF now than they were before. So we imagine it might be a bit delayed in finding out what your new payment count or whether or not you receive forgiveness might take a bit longer. But so the Department of Education does these in batches. So there's no direct timeline for when you might hear from them.
Awesome. Thanks, Amy. And then we've gotten a question about, so does someone have to, this is to
Cassandra. How you doing?
Oh, I'm sorry. Did someone
Unfortunately, Joe won't be able to
go
make it
on mute?
today. I apologize for the late notice. We were trying to get there. I was wondering also, should I call in the morning regarding the
Oh, thanks. Alrighty. Amy, so someone's asking, after someone reaches, 120 qualifying payments, do they have to stay at a qualifying employer, or once you reach the 120, is the debt canceled?
So this is a great question. So this is something that changed during the payment pause. So if you've made 120 payments, you can submit your application and be retired. Prior to that, people were, delaying retirement to get those extra qualifying payments because the former rules were that you had to be employed at the time that you applied. And, that was a huge burden for people, right? Because they were, waiting months to hear back from the Department of Education when they could have been retired at that point. So if you've made over 120 payments, you can be retired and apply for PSLF still. Yeah, did that answer your question, Kat?
Yeah, that was great. And actually, one thing I was going to follow up too is also to add on to that, even if you're not at your 10 years of service, you might be 1 year in, you might be 8 years in. Still take advantage of this waiver, because the whole point is that you might get credit for payments that otherwise would not count under PSLF. And we've gotten a couple of questions about this. For example, do you have to make your payment by a certain date in the month? Generally, under PSLF rules, if your payment is even like a day late or past the grace period, you don't get credit for that payment. Under the waiver, you're going to get credit for payments where you may have underpaid for a month, you may have been late on a payment for a month. And so even if you, or just as long as your loans were considered in repayment status, right? So it's really important to make sure that during this waiver process, even if you're not going to be at 120 payments, just to get credit for, you never know if you're going to be in public service for 10 years. You don't know, so you might as well get the credit. There's really not a downside to trying to get that extra credit for the waiver. So just making sure that you take advantage of that. Amy, we've also gotten a couple of questions about people who need to take 2 steps, both people who need to consolidate, but then also people who need to submit a PSLF form. Is there an important order to that process?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's why we recommend that you do the steps in order of this presentation. So, first confirm your employers are eligible, and then check your loan types and find out if you have direct loans or non-direct loans, and consolidate first if you have to. And then submit your PSLF forms, because again, the process for getting forgiveness is that they're going to send, once you submit your application, the first thing they're going to do is check loan eligibility. So if you don't have a direct loan, your application will immediately be rejected or delayed because they'll see that you don't have a direct loan. So that's why you should consolidate first, and then follow the rest of the steps by submitting your PSLF forms for your employment.
Thanks, Amy. So someone has an older loan. I believe they probably either have a FFEL or Perkins loan, but they said they need to consolidate in order to get into a direct loan. Under this waiver period, will they be able to still keep the credit from that older loan?
Yes, so that is one of the important things about the waiver period is that you can keep that old credit that you had towards loan forgiveness. That was one of the huge pitfalls of the previous, rules of the PSLF program. And so yes, during the waiver period, you can keep that past credit. Remember that, I flagged at the very end that is a common issue people experience. So you're going to get you might still get an auto-generated letter that says that you have one qualifying payment, which can be really scary for folks, right? So, you'll get a second letter that has your updated payment count that again is that first letter is auto-generated under the old program requirements. So that's why you receive that, because they were, kind of implementing the waiver and building it as it was happening. And so, so yes, you can keep your old credit, but remember that you might get a letter that says that you only have one qualifying payment, but you should wait to receive a second letter that has your updated payment count. So I know that that's confusing and a little bit unnerving for folks, but I just want to flag that.
Thanks, Amy. That's really helpful. And just another reminder, October 31st. So in order for you to still get the credit, you have to do it before October 31st. We've also gotten a couple of questions from people asking if we can share the slide deck. We will share the slide. I also want to flag, I'm going to drop it right now in the chat. So for anyone who wants to see it, we do have a website called forgivemystudentdebt.org. It's a website that the SVPC created with several of our partners in labor unions. And it literally walks through all the steps that Amy just went through. So there are also not only some short videos that walk through these steps, but it goes step by step and includes some frequently asked questions, many that were asked today, and then a couple that we may not get time to answer today. So really encourage everyone to go to that website if you have any other questions after this webinar. We've also been asked if we have specific consultants or people at the SVPC who answer questions. Unfortunately, we do not provide direct services, but because you are in New York, you do have, for example, like a student loan ombudsperson. I believe they're called a student loan advocate at the Department of Financial Services. And so we'll also be sure to share that information so that you do know that there are additional resources. And I think we maybe have one more time for one more question. I think we've gotten this a couple of times. So, well, two more questions, because I do want to answer one. Amy, can you talk a little bit about, we talked a lot about consolidation. People want to know, is there anything like, you know, any other, like maybe a downside to consolidation or anything that people need to worry about consolidation?
Yeah, sure. So something that could happen with consolidation is that your interest rate could change. You know, that could be something that you would want to pay attention to. But given the like time sensitive issues and that this is kind of unprecedented, right? That there's the Pslf waiver happening and the Idr account adjustment happening, the benefits of consolidation are really strong. But certainly like there are things to consider. You know, we can't speak to everyone's personal financial situation, but I would say the interest rate is the big one to consider.
Thanks so much, Amy. And then just one last question. I'm sorry, I know we're really close to time, but I want to answer this one. So Amy talked about loan servicers being transferred from Fed loan to MOHELA. So if you have already submitted a PSLF form at any point in your career, whether it's while you've been at teachers college or, you know, previously from another time in your career, your student loan servicer is likely Fed loan. If you have Fed loan, you will be transferred to MOHELA. MOHELA is now the primary servicer for for public service loan forgiveness. So also, like Amy said, when you go through and do your employer certification forms, remember you're going to do an individual employer certification form for each employer that you've had. You're going to submit that to MOHELA. Someone asked, I'm being transferred to Nelnet. That is also a federal student loan servicer. You may hear that you're being transferred to Aidvantage. That is a federal student loan servicer. But one clue, if you're not being transferred to MOHELA, that likely means you do not have a PSLF form on file. So if you're ever wondering if you've ever raised your hand to get qualifying service, if you do not currently have Fed loan and are being transferred to MOHELA or not currently with MOHELA, you likely have never submitted a PSLF form. So that's just kind of like one flag. If you're not being either transferred or already with MOHELA, you likely need to submit a PSLF form. And so I'll just leave it with that one. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kat.
Thank you both so much. Amazing. I don't know how you rapid fire answered so many questions in such a short amount of time. If you haven't had your question answered precisely, don't fear. We'll have more workshops. They're great resources we'll follow up with for the TC community. Tanya, anything else to add?
Just to thank our presenters, Amy and Kat, so appreciates this expertise, this deep dive into this, and for impressing upon our folks here the urgency around making this happen for themselves if possible. So thank you so much, and thanks everyone for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having
again.
us.
Thanks for having us.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Take care. Bye.